Good to have you on. I got you back. Welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Public Programs Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Unfortunately, our Executive Director, Jonathan Brent, could not be here with us tonight, but he sends his greeting and wants you all to know he wishes he could for this very important celebration of Avrom Sutzkever's work. Before we get started, I just want to say one quick note that we've got our spring newsletter on the table in the back, and it's got a wonderful list of the programs coming up this spring. We've got a lot of really exciting stuff happening, so check it out if you haven't already. Avrom Sutzkever died 10 years ago last Monday. His importance to the Yiddish language, to poetry, and to YIVO in particular can't be overstated. In his own words, and I'm going to read it in Yiddish and then in English, don't worry. Als ich sag dem Klang YIVO, sehe ich vor sich die größte Erhabenkeit in Jerusalem delita in Maschach von die letzten 20 Jahre bis in Chorben. Erst in der Ghetto-Zeit hat sich angelegt in mir der größere Koech zum jüdischen Wort. Ich soll ihm raten von unter die Chorbes. Ich soll ihm raten von die deutschen Nägel, was haben sich einklammert in einem heiligen YIVO. When I say the word YIVO and hear its sound, I see before me something of the greatest nobility in the Jerusalem of Lithuania in the 20 years preceding the Holocaust. It was not until my time in the ghetto that the great power of the Yiddish word revealed itself within me, demanding that I should save it from being buried under the ruins. I was to save it from the Germans who had got their claws into our sacred YIVO. As many here tonight, I'm sure know, Sutzkever smuggled YIVO documents and books as a part of the paper brigade, hiding them during the war, rescuing them, and sending them to YIVO afterwards. We have this material upstairs in this building, nearly 9 linear feet of material in record group 223, the Sutzkever-Kaczerginski collection, named after Avrom Sutzkever and also another poet, Shmirka Kaczerginski, who was also a part of the paper brigade. They saved incredible treasures of Jewish history and culture. The Pincus of the Vilna Gaon's Cloys, a diary of Theodor Herzl, correspondences and manuscripts of Mendele Moicher's Forum, Yudlamed Peretz, Sholem Aleichem, Shin Ansky, and many others, and so much more. Sutzkever also fought as a partisan. He ultimately survived the war in the Soviet Union, and he moved to Tel Aviv after the war, where he rebuilt his life in the burgeoning state of Israel, and where his family lives to this day. Sutzkever testified as a witness in the Nuremberg trials and published moving, articulate accounts of his experiences during the war in both prose and poetry. He was a chronicler to the history to which he bore witness. It is in these various capacities that we often remember Sutzkever, as a book smuggler, as a partisan, and as a chronicler of history. And yet what we'd like to take this opportunity tonight to remember him as a poet, a wordsmith, an artist. What does this mean when his work was, of course, shaped by the unbelievable circumstances of his life, responding to turmoil which is a microcosm of the Jewish experience of the last 100 years? Can poetry be removed from history? What do we find in Sutzkever's voice beyond the circumstances that gave rise to his poetry? We will proceed by turning our attention to the words themselves. We'll read a series of poems by Sutzkever, which you'll also have reprinted in your Yiddish and English translation in your programs, so that's a special thing to take home, and you can follow along. And we'll have short reflections following each poem, and we'll sit down for a discussion, trying to tease out some insight into this great poet's work. I'm joined tonight by Barbara Harshav and Ruth Weiss, both of whom are extremely erudite, a translator and a literary scholar, respectively. I think They need no introduction, but for those unfamiliar with them, I encourage you to read the biographies that are in the program, and I strongly encourage you to get to know their very important work. As you may notice, Irina Klepfish, the wonderful poet who was supposed to be the third member of tonight's panel, is sadly not with us. She's very sorry to miss this evening, but was unable to join. She's recovering from an unexpected surgery, but all is well, just not well enough to be here tonight. Fortunately, Irina has recorded some remarks for us at home, which we'll hear later tonight. I'd like to begin the evening with one of my own personal favorites Sutzkever poems, a poem which is about poetry itself. Poesie. A tunkel violette Fläum, die letzte Affenbäum, din heiteldig und zart wie a Schwarzappel, was hat bei Nacht in Toi geloschen. Liebe, Sehung, Zappel. Und mitten Morgenstern ist der Toi gewohren Glingo. Das ist Poesie. Rier sie an a Zoi, me soll nicht sein kein Simmen von die Finger. Poetry. A dark violet plum, the last one on the tree, thin-skinned and delicate as the pupil of an eye, that in the dew at night blots out love, visions, shivering. And then at the morning star, the dew grows weightless. That is poetry. Touch it so lightly that you don't leave a fingerprint. To me, this poem is a kind of credo for Sutzkever. Poetry elevates the ordinary to the heavenly. The plum of the opening sublimates and becomes love and visions, just as a dewdrop evaporates and becomes air. A simple quotidian image becomes something magical, almost a prayer. Sutzkever said of this poem, Efter is gor Poesie der Heben die Wochigkeit Kule Shabbos. Dichtung, das ist Harmonie von alles Tieres, der Scholem zwischen Tod und Leben, der Verknassung von Form und Inhalt, von Ethik und Ästhetik. Perhaps poetry is elevating the quotidian into a pure Shabbos. Poetry is harmony of all contradictions, peace between death and life, the fusing of form and content, of ethics and aesthetics. That was Sutzkever. Whatever the subject matter, Sutzkever has an eye for the kind of observations that elevate a moment into poetry, or in some cases, which rise to the occasion of an already loaded moment. On that note, I'm going to turn the microphone over to a special guest, Sandra Tirtescu, who's going to read the next poem, Naratosh Forest, which Irina Klepfish would have read. And then we'll hear some thoughts from Irke on it. Sandra.
Narotscher Wald. Mit Vilna in Harz, wir Keul zurieren, mit gepulverte Lieder, geladen in Bix, liege ich in Rauf zu der Horchen, der Spieren, schwarze Tritt, zwischen Gras und Gewichs. Durch frischen Gras, durch beginnendem Reinem, gehen, die schwarze Tritt. Ich weiß, ich bin ein Wolf und ein Dichter in einem, und befrei von der Bix, ein Lied noch ein Lied. A Blitz, a Fall, und der Teu von die Bämer bespritzt meine Bremen in gildener Schreck. Und ich höre, wie ein Baskol sagt mir Leimer, hast abgewischt von der Erde a Fleck. Narotscher Wald, dem 9. Oktober 1943. Narotch Forest. With Vilna in my heart, like a bullet that cannot be removed, with poems turned into powder and loaded into my gun, I lie here in a ditch to listen and detect dark footsteps amid the grass and plants. Through the new-grown grass, through the unspoiled dawn, on and on the dark footsteps go. I know this. I am a wolf and a poet in one, and I release from the gun poem after poem. A shot, a fall. The dew from the trees sprinkles my brow with gilded fear, and I hear a heavenly voice say to me, "You've wiped a blemish off the earth."
No, I think the question is, why did I pick this poem? And I think I picked this poem for a number of reasons. I mean, I found the poem interesting because it was a poem written while he was a partisan. It's dated October 9th, 1943, and he left the Vilna Ghetto on September 12th. September 12th is also the date that he gives for Die Bleine Platten von Roms Druckerei, the lead plates of the publishing house Rom, which was the famous publishing house in Vilna, responsible for religious and secular texts. And it's interesting that he dates it the day he left the ghetto. It seems almost impossible. Maybe he'd been working on it. Whatever the case is, the poem Die Bleine Platten is basically a pre-partisan poem that's really urging Jews in the ghetto to fight back, to retain their courage. And it does so in a really interesting way that I think contrasts with the poem Narosh Forest. He does that with a collective we. He says that wir Träumer müssen werden Soldaten. We dreamers must become soldiers. And the melting of the lead plates are really the plates of all of Jewish history and life, religious and secular. So that's a collective too, that he's asking Jews to draw upon, to act collectively and to draw upon collectively their strength, which is their spirit, which is embedded in the sacred letters of the Jewish alphabet, of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, it's interesting that that poem, which is so much a cry to the public, is done in a totally moment when he's totally identified with the Jewish people. Naroch Forest, however, is a very individual poem. It's a personal poem. It's in the first person. Ich bin a wolf und a dichter in einen. I am a wolf and a poet blended. I don't know how to, in einem, how to translate that, in one, basically. And what is being used, whereas in the Bleine Platten, it was the collective wisdom and strength and history of the Jewish people was being used. In the Naroch Forest, what's being used are Sutzkever's individual poems. The poems, his own poems, become his protection, become his bullets. Now, there are some other things to really observe about this poem, I think, that are important. I mean, I think Sutzkever had an almost mystical attitude towards his own poetry and towards Yiddish and towards the Hebrew alphabet. And it's, I think, significant that he's using his poems here as protection. He once said, this was in a speech that he gave in 1959, that he said, it was not until my time in the ghetto that the great power of the Yiddish word revealed itself within me, demanding that I should save it from being buried under the ruins. It's interesting that he has this sense that the Yiddish word has a kind of power, which is then expressed through his poetry. It's, I think, important that in noticing it here, because his poetry becomes bullets. That's his protection. He's a partisan who's using his poems as a kind of protection. And in the same way that he was urging Jews to look to their past, in Die Bleine Platten, Jews collectively to look to their past to protect them. And the question becomes, I think, to what degree is this expression of protection, this loading of his gun with poems, to what degree does it protect him? In this poem, there's an enemy. We don't know. It's not defined. It's schwarze Tritt. It's dark footsteps. And there is some kind of an exchange. We can assume somebody was killed, and for the moment he is safe. But the poem ends in a sort of interesting way, because it doesn't end with Sutzkever expressing what he feels about what just happened, but rather with this voice that comes from somewhere on high that can see him and his situation from a very different perspective, a further perspective. And we have this rather strange ending to this poem in which he says, the voice says to him, "You've now wiped a blemish off the earth." Now that doesn't sound like a very satisfied ending to this encounter. He's not hearing approval or encouragement or even a minor sense of triumph at all. It seems to me a strange ending that's really kind of puts down almost what he's done. What he's done is gotten rid of a fleck. Now, Sutzkever's situation as a partisan was a very difficult one. He says in that speech in Montreal, he wrote, 1.5 months after our arrival in the forest, we were surrounded by 15,000 Germans. There was chaos in the forest. The partisans could not engage in such an unequal battle, so they decided to retreat and disperse all around the neighboring woods. We were helpless and didn't know where to turn, in which direction to go. Our leaders had dispersed. Shmerka, my wife, and I crawled into the swamps and lay hidden there. This is certainly not the kind of condition that's anticipated in Die Bleierne Platten. This is a very bleak situation in which they feel outnumbered. They were often not armed or disarmed when they had arms. So that his situation in this particular moment is a very difficult one. Yes, he's managed to overcome this one enemy, but it's just a fleck. It's a minor event. I think what we're getting here is the private moment of Sutzkever reflecting and maybe despairing, maybe feeling a certain amount of helplessness and feeling that his poems, in fact, do not protect him. There's a significant difference in tone at the end of the poem than there is at the beginning, where there's hope. If he loads his pistol with his poems, he'll be safe. But he's really not safe, and he's still in a ditch, and he's still really alone. You don't have a sense of comrades around him. And I think what moves me in this poem is that it focuses on a moment that is very private. And I'm very moved by the fact that Sutzkever wanted to record it and wanted to save it. This is not a public stance. This is not a poem that would encourage anybody to fight back necessarily. But it acknowledges that we have moments that, in fact, we feel deflated and defeated, and we don't have very much hope. It's certainly not something he would have wanted to publicize. And I wonder about that because the poem has a very strange publication history. It's just totally absent in all of his collections after the war. It's absent from the 1963 collection of his collected works, which was more than 1,000 pages, 2 volumes. And it's absent from Lieder von Yom HaMoves, which was specifically a collection of poems from Vilna, the forest, and other wanderings. And it doesn't really appear until 1982 in a collection called Von Alte und Junge Xaviaden, from old and recent manuscripts. So it makes me think perhaps, though he did not want to destroy the poem, he also did not want a lot of people to see it, at least initially. And he only published it almost 40 years after he wrote it. And that was unusual, I think, in terms of his publication history. So let me end with that. And to just remind you of what I've been talking about, let me just read one more time the Narosh der Wald. Mit Vilna in Harz, wie a Keul nizurieren, mit gepulverter Lieder, geloden in Bix, lieg ich in Rauf, zu der Hochen der Spieren, schwarze Tritt, zwischen Gras und Gewächs. Durch frischen Gras, durch Baginem, dem Reinem, gehen die schwarze Tritt. Ich weiß, ich bin ein Wolf und ein Dichter in einem und war frei von der Bix, a Lied noch a Lied. A Blitz, a Fall, und der Teuf und die Bäume bespritzt meine Bremen in gildener Schreck, und ich hör, wie a Beiskol sagt mir Lämmer, hast abgewischt von der Erd a Fleck.
And now I want to invite up Bobby Harshav and very special guest Anita Norwich, a wonderful literary scholar, who are going to together read the next selection for the evening. It's a long poem, so they're going to go back and forth. Anita will do the Yiddish, and Bobby will do the English. Please.
Sorry. Let's start. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Why don't I just stop there and yell? Sure. Can you hear? Yes, right? Okay. Der Schmechel von Majdanek. Nit grebe wie das Heitel von dem Oeug, mein Schochenstier. Nit grebe von der gin goldene Kretschme, wo's kommt da rein, wo's fällt da rein, am Miedetoi zu nächtigen. Nit grebe von a Schotten abgeschunden von dem Hammer. Halmai gerot mir keinmal nit zu öffnen die Tür, als bis a Hackel ist die Tür von keinem nit verschlossen. Und mein Sammenonster, Sammenknonster, halmai kann nit durch derselbe Tür herein zum Schochen und sagen ihm a poscheten Guten Morgen. Die Tür ist durchsichtig wie Schreck. Die Tür ist nicht verschlossen.
I'll try not to break it. Is that good? Can you hear me? Good. The smile of my Danik. No thicker than the membrane of an eye, my neighbor's door. No thicker than the spun gold tavern, where a weary dewdrop staggers in for the night. No thicker than a shadow flayed from the flesh. Wherefore do I never succeed in opening the door when, after all, the door was never locked? And he, my bosom friend, my poison friend, wherefore can he not go through the same door to his neighbor and simply say to him, good morning? The door is lucid as fear. The door is not locked.
Wie weit ist a vergangene Sekund? Ist weiter bloß mit 1 Sekund von jeden Heint und Morgen. Mein Schochen ist allein als a vergangene Sekund, erzeugen mit der Maske, als die Wund soll sein verborgen.
How far is a bygone second? Just 1 second far from any today and tomorrow. My neighbor is himself a bygone second, covered with a mask to conceal his wound.
Mein Schochen klappt in Tier, also zu sagen, es ist angespolten wie a Puste bei dem Top die Erd Und kaum der langst a Setz, a Kappel fester, zerfällt sie unter dir auf Asch und Parach. Und alle Jammen heuden sich zurück herein in Himmel und läschen euch die Scheiterhäufens, was mir ruft sie sterben. Efter kannst du mir antleihen Fliegel, wegzufliehen auf einem mehr gesicherten Planet? Onüberklar bin ich von dannen Ocker. A Gottsrachmanes auf die Erde geborene, was seinen schuldig Äppel, als ihr Tag als Armin Heuke?
My neighbor knocks on the door, as if to say, a hollow attic vessel, the earth is cracked. Just hit it a little harder and it crumbles into ash and dust. And all the seas swing back into the sky and put out the bonfires we call the stars. So maybe you can lend me wings to fly away to a safer planet. Without a second thought, I'm moving out of here. God's mercy on the earthborn. Is it the apple's fault I carry such a hump?
Auf a Krematorie kräumen in Medinas Polen a Borwüsse mit Fies herabgehangene wie Kindweiß beim Chappen Fisch in lullevdicken Wasser sitzt mein Schochen. Ihm cholmt sich, dem Hecker von sein Wänden hat ihm allein vermanjet mit dem finkeldicken Wärmel. Ist allein sein Fanger auf der langen, dünnen Wände. Ist allein sein eigene Legende.
In a crematorium chimney in the land of Poland, barefoot, feet dangling as in childhood, fishing in lulav reedy water, my neighbor sits. He's dreaming. The hook of his own pole trapped him with a glimmering worm. He is his own catcher on the long, thin pole. He himself is his own legend.
Wassersteiger tut auf den Käumen, wenn jener hat schon lang von Reutenbeuch herausgelabert mein Schochens parmettene Stadt mit Jiden. Halt in Hand a Spiegele und spiegelt euch, wie Kindweiß a Sonnhäsel auf dem Panem von sein Säden, a grünem Schmechel, was warft an auf alt und jung, a Panik. Und lasst nicht cholmen und lasst nicht schweigen, reden, spiegelt euch und spiegelt ein in dem Schmechel von Majdanek.
What do you think he's doing on the chimney when someone long ago dredged up from the red belly my neighbor's parchment city of Jews? He holds a little mirror in his hand and casts, as in childhood, spots of sun on Grandpa's face. A green smile raining panic on old and young. It won't let you dream, be silent, talk. He casts out, casts into you the smile of Majdanek.
Der Schmeichel von Majdanek fällt auf Chassanes und Brissen, in Opere, Theater, hinter die Kulissen, in Knätschen von dein Bräut und Salz, gesalzenem Gewissen. Der grüne Schmeichel fällt auf deine Legie, dein Ballade und auf Aliade Zitterklang, besonder. Der Schmeichel fällt mit schippendicken Feier in besten Wein, Burgunder, Zitokaie. Fällt auf niedrige Statius, kaum gemappete wie Schwammen, und auf den heuchen Binien von die Nazis die Vereinigte, und Heche auf den silbernen Wandrovnik zu die Turmen.
The smile of Majdanek falls on wedding, bris, in opera theater, in the wings in creases of your bread and salt, salty conscience. The green smile falls on your elegy, your ballad, on every tremor of a sound. The smile falls with hissing fire into the best wine, Burgundy or Tokay. It falls on squat depots, barely mapped, like mushrooms, on the tall building of the United Nations, and higher on the silver wanderer to the abysses.
Und keiner weiß nicht, als in Sommernacht gesalbte, hochgewölbige, in schneeige, zerregende Geräumen, Aborwisse mit Fies herabgehangene wie Kindweiß. Mein Schochen sitzt in Peuden auf Verkäumen, betracht die schöne Wahr, was ist kein Wahr nicht. Und was mein Schochen tut, ist als dasselbige. Halt in Hand a Spiegele, mehr gar nicht.
And nobody knows that on anointed, high-domed summer nights, in snowy or rainy spaces, barefoot, feet dangling as in childhood, my neighbor sits in Poland on a chimney, ponders the beautiful reality that is not real. And what my neighbor does is ever the same. He holds in his hand a little mirror, nothing more. Now, can I say a few words? A personal memory. Long before I met Avrom Sutzkever, a friend of mine who had been in the ghetto with him in Vilna told me a wonderful story about him. He had come to visit them in Tel Aviv, and as he was going out, he adjusted his hat in the mirror. The mirror is important. And he said, "Ay, der Spiegel ist alt geworden." For those of you who didn't get this, the mirror has become old or has grown old. I chose this poem because I've known it for years and I love it. And frankly, I don't understand it. But I think the images are incredible. And so that's why I wanted to present it this evening. And if anybody will care to explain it to me, I would be very happy. No, it's a beautiful poem, I think. But one of those, yes. Aha. Yes, speak louder. About what? Interesting. Interesting. She said if she sees it as a poem of betrayal. I'm not. That's an interesting interpretation. What strikes me again, all the mirror things, but also this notion that how can I not get through the door even though the door is never locked? That's a trope in Jewish history, and that fascinates me. You know, I can't go through this thin membrane that's a door, even though it's never locked. And what prevents us from interacting with somebody? And yes, yes. The poet. Right. That's possible. And I also look at this whole issue of the feet dangling as in childhood. No, as I say, I can't put the whole damn thing together, but yes. Interesting. This is, okay, shall I stop? Thank you all for suggesting these things to me. If I ever understand it, I will let you know.
Thank you, Bobby. We'll have some more time for audience participation, the Q&A at the end. Thank you for all that insight. And now I want to invite up Ruth Weiss for the last poem.
Well, if it's Sutzkever had to die, it's at least a great honor and pleasure to be able to speak about him as often as possible. This is the poem that I have written about the most, a long article. I talk about it the most. I thought tonight that I would choose a new poem, but then when I went through the whole book in which this appears, I decided that I would, for all that, return to this poem. One of my reasons for returning to it so often is that I want it to become part of Jewish liturgy. I think that's where it belongs, and I think that this is one way of presenting it and speaking about it and rehearsing it over and over again to see whether those who absorb it into liturgy might think of doing this. The liturgy does, of course, have Aramaic in it, and so I think that one can find a place in the liturgy for a Yiddish poem that fits in it. So this poem, Shehechionu, was first published with no title at all. It was published first in Auf der Wach, on guard, on November 25th, 1948. It was published in a Munich weekly of the displaced persons camp, and it was an organ of Shomer HaTzair, which was published in Israel for the Munich camp. Sutzkever then republished it many times, and he dated it 1947, even though it was published in 1948. 1947 is when Sutzkever and his wife and their baby daughter arrived in Israel. They had difficulty. The British were not allowing Jews into Palestine at that time. It was before the creation of the State of Israel. And Golda Meir intervened in order to get him the possibility of coming to Israel. And this is a poem that he writes, obviously, on the occasion of coming to the land of Israel, because even though he didn't title it, he later published it under the heading of Shehechionu. And you may know that the prayer of Shehechionu is something that one pronounces, it's a blessing that one pronounces, thanks for new and unusual experiences. It's recited at the beginning of a holiday. It's recited at the performance of certain mitzvahs, like sitting in a sukkah or lighting the Hanukkah candles. And many people say this prayer on first coming to the land of Israel. So the prayer is, Shehechionu v'kimonu v'higiyonu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, God, King of the universe, who has granted us life, who has sustained us, and who has enabled us to reach this occasion. But this is very interesting here that instead of pronouncing this prayer in that positive way, who has sustained us and who has granted us life and who has brought us to this poem is set in the conditional tense. And it reads as follows. Wenn ich wollt nicht sein mit dir beinand, nicht ottomen das Glück und Weh da. Wenn ich wollt nicht brennen mit dem Land, vulkanisch Land in Chevle Lede. Wenn ich wollt hat sind nach meiner Käde, nicht mitgeboren mit dem Land, wo jeder Ständel ist mein Seide. Gesättigt wollt mich nicht das Bräut, das Wasser nicht gestillt mein Gummen. Bis ausgegangen ich wollt vergeut und bloß mein Bänkschaft wollt gekommen. Now, it says in your papers that I am the translator of this. I am not the translator of it, and if you'll see, there's a great difference between this translation and the translation, the elegant translation of Bobby Harshav and of Hannah Bloch, the other two translators who are represented in the handouts that you have, and of course of Irina Klepfish. And one of the reasons that it's so hard to translate is because this poem is about untranslatability. And it says in prosaic transposition, if I were not together with you, wenn ich wollt nicht sein mit dir beinand, nicht ottomen das Glück und Weh da, if I were not breathing joy and pain here, if I were not burning with this land, this volcanic land in its birth throes, if I were not, after my Akedah, the Akedah being the sacrifice of Isaac, if I were not reborn with this land where every pebble is my grandfather, then bread would not sate my hunger, water would not soothe my gums, and I would die. Bis ausgegangen, I would expire, vergeut, gentiled. One of the many, many neologisms that Sutzkever created, new words, and my yearning would come on its own. So what do we have here? The word not appears in the 11 lines of this poem 6 times. So this very affirmative poem, Shehechionu, this prayer of Shehechionu, is written in the form of how much more possible it would have been for me not to have come. That the possibility of not having been able to reach the land was so much more probable than the actuality of having reached the land. And so it is written in the conditional sense, almost as if written from the point of view of if I hadn't. And this brings us to the situation of Sutzkever at that point, which he was very difficult as a poem, trying to reconcile things which were not often able to be reconciled very easily. And here at this point, I think this is one of the most difficult moments that he had. On the one hand, coming finally to the land of Israel, his brother had come there before him in the 1930s. One can imagine how he felt actually having made it there in safety with his wife and daughter after the destruction of Vilna and after all you have heard and all he knew and his testimony to what happened in the ghetto of Vilna. So the joy of coming is what this poem is, the joy, the pain, but the joy. On the other hand, everything was destroyed. And one has to understand the Book of Lamentations, I find the most terrible thing in this world, the most terrible piece of writing I know. I find it impossible to read. You read it usually on the time of mourning, after the 3 weeks of mourning in the summer. But the Book of Lamentations is written, after all, about the destruction of the temple. And for all that it is so horrible, if you go back to it, the Jews knew that they would return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple in some form. They knew that they would return. So the destruction is cast in this sense of knowing that you would return. But Sutzkever writes this, and there was no returning to Vilna. So the destruction of the Jews of Vilna and all that that stands for figures on a different level, because there is no sense that any of that can ever be salvaged. And so on the one hand, you are coming now to the rebirth of the land of Israel, and you see how this poem is about rebirth, birth pangs. Birth pangs are painful, but they are also joyous. And he's experiencing that, this volcanic land being reborn. I mean, it's the rebirth of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, which had been under foreign domination for 2,000 years. That is like the most unbelievable moment to be part of that. And yet, you are at the same time speaking for those who will not be able to reach it. And so the poem is written in that very conditional form. And it says that if I had not made it here, I could not eat to satiety. I could not really taste the bread. Water would not still my thirst. It's very dense. Every single line here, every word is heavy with meaning. But in the time that we have, I think to get to where the poem goes, you can see that these 11 lines, sort of one sentence, all of it, right? All of it leading to the point that if I had not, were I not with you, were I not breathing this with you, were I not reborn with you, then I could not have taste, I could not quench my thirst, till I would expire vergoit. And this is what makes it untranslatable. It sounds like a very normal Yiddish word. Die Zoon vergeht, and this past participle, ich bin geworden vergoit. But you see, it has in it the word, I would be turned to Gentile. That's the form of death that my not coming here would have taken. So you think that that is kind of the climax of the poem. And Uriel Weinreich, who was my teacher, wrote about the rhyming scheme of this poem. He was so fascinated by the rhyming scheme about which one can say a great deal. But to me, one of the interesting things is about this Fargoit is that it's one of those rhymes that appears in the poetry of American Yiddish poets very much because they were sweatshop poets. And if you take that term, Breut, bread, you can see that it almost rhymes itself with noit, need, reut, red blood, toit, death. And it's almost a poem in itself. Noit, breut, toit, so not for Sutzkever. What he does is to create this word, gentiled. It's much better than assimilated. It's much better than, anything. That's the form of death that it would have taken. But here's to get to this, but that's not the end of the poem. So it says that if I had not come here, I would have, in some sense, been dead. My senses would have been dead, and I would have been dead in this particular way. But then there is an 11th line. And the 11th line says, but my longing would have come on its own. Und bloß mein Bänkschaft wollt gekommen. So that all those who did not make it, all that power of Jewish life and those years that didn't make it to this, the majority that didn't make it, that longing has come on its own. So I think that what was said by Rena Klepfish about the collective and the individual, I think this poem has in it, of course, the passion of the individual, but it is also written very much from the perspective of the collective. And it is written, you see how astonishingly, it seems to me, it says everything about the unbelievable joy, the unbelievable necessity of having come, and says that even if I had not, my longing would still have been here. I think it's a great work, and so I'm glad for this opportunity, Alex, to talk about it. Thanks.
Bobby, do you want to come back up for this conversation? So I will get the conversation started off with some questions, and then we can open it up to the audience for some further questions.
This is also Shechionu. We haven't seen each other for a long time.
So I want to first of all thank everyone once again for these presentations, for these readings. It may seem obvious, so obvious as to not be worth mentioning, but I thought we could start this conversation off with the question, why Yiddish? Because Sutzkever, was in Poland before the war. He could have written in Polish, he could have written in Russian, and he could have written in Hebrew. And in fact, he wrote a little bit in Hebrew, and of course he moved to Israel and could have written in Hebrew. So why Yiddish?
Well, there are many Yiddish writers of whom one could say that. Bergelsson could have written in other languages. Certainly, Mendele Moichersforum, Peretz, Shalom Aleichem, the three classic writers did write in other languages. Many Yiddish writers could have written in another language. I think, though, that you're not entirely right. Sutzkever could not have written in another language. Yes, he knew Polish, and he had read a lot of Polish poetry. Yes, he knew Russian, and he describes how when he had to speak at Nuremberg, he wanted to speak in Yiddish, but it was not one of the languages of the Nuremberg trials, and so they made him speak in Russian. And he says somehow magically the language came to him because although he had just spent 2 years in Russia, this was not his natural language. And he lived in France for a while, but I don't think that his Hebrew was never proficient. It was good enough to, go to cafes and to flirt and do all kinds of things, right? But so I think that the most obvious reason is that this was his language. But I also think that there's nobody, the poet, there are great Yiddish poets, but I think he really is one of the great masters of the Yiddish language. It was his instrument, and he loved it more and more. And even in the poem that you quoted, he says, Same, he says, mein Same, and then he says, Samik. Samik is also not a word that existed in Yiddish before. So Same means most, and then Samik means poisonous. So he plays with the language. And as a musician yourself, I think that you can understand what it is to have one instrument which is yours. Yes, you can play other instruments, but how can you exchange it for the one that's really yours?
Is this thing on? Yeah. Okay. Another neologism that Anita and I talked about yesterday. It's when it falls on. Louder. Good. Okay. It falls on. It's the United Nations that we translate, but it's United Nazism. But you can't nations Nazism, right? Or Nazis. Yeah. Nazis. Right.
Yes.
No, he was a master of language, and that's what makes him hard to translate.
Yes. No, and even when you said it was both ethic and aesthetic, but in fact, Sutzkever loved to quote Vilna sayings, and there were many, many sayings that he picked up from Vilna. In other words, this is Vilna's speech, and among the Yung-Vilne, they said ethic, aesthetic, est ethic. Not that there was a combination of the two, but aesthetic, est ethic. In other words, aestheticism eats, consumes ethics. That is an anti-aesthetic saying, right? And a very Yiddish saying, right? A very, very Jewish concept that to get lost in aestheticism, this is, not what we were about, as it were. Even though, of course, he is extraordinarily refined. Yes.
Right, Sutzkever is very much playing on that line of really being about aesthetics, even at the same time as saying something like that.
Exactly.
So in the tablet magazine obituary following Sutzkever's death, Zachary Schollenberger describes Sutzkever's work as born of history but unfettered by it. Would you agree? How can we parse history, the circumstances that this work was created in, and in some cases, the topics of these poems, with work in a more abstract sense? Does it?
Well, it's. I think that nobody I know. I mean, I said this in the film that was made about him. I don't know of anyone who has a life like his. It's the most extraordinary biography because it touches on Jewish history at every single point in the 20th century. I mean, it's just where history happens to the Jews. It just so happens that that's where he happens to be in many cases and makes himself be. So yes, he is a witness to history, and he did feel that he was a witness to history. I mean, the clearest example of it is that after the war, when he was in Moscow, the thing that he did there before testifying at the Nuremberg trials, and the reason that he was chosen by Ilya Ehrenberg and put forth as the only person to speak on behalf of the Jews at the Nuremberg trials, was because he meticulously wrote what happened in the Vilna Ghetto from the point of view of a prosecutor. In other words, it was not to say, that people read poetry and all the rest of it. That appears there, but it was not a paean to the Jewish survival. That he did in his poetry afterwards. But what he wrote about the Vilna Ghetto is what were the names of the Nazi officers? What did they do to the Jews? On what days did they do it? He knew that one had to bear witness. So in that sense, he made himself, he was able to make himself a hard witness. If you've ever read a prosaic book, that is prosaic. Also, by the way, afterwards, when he got to Israel and he set up his own journal, the best journal in the Yiddish language, he wrote about all the Russian Yiddish writers whom he had met in the Soviet Union. There, too, he felt that he had the obligation. Who met Markish? Who had seen these people? Now they had been murdered by Stalin. So who was going to bear witness to that? So he wrote depositions about what his encounters with them were like, what they were like, and so forth. So in one real sense, there is that side of him that knew how important it was to really keep score, you could say, to really keep history intact, and not to aestheticize it. On the other hand, your question is well put, because when one reads the poems, they are certainly much more than testimony. They're not.
You know, I think to us, in a kind of metaphorical way, we're all living in our own history. And the question is, you know, what do we do with it? Do we recognize it? You know, it's a real question. We are every day, as an historian, I would say that. Is that right? Okay. That history weighs on us.
Well, it's
Some have more.
yes. I mean, and some of the poems, by the way, are really very delightful. For example, in the last years, for about 20 years, Sutzkever wrote a series of poems which he calls poems from a diary.
Right.
Which is a contradiction in itself. A diary is one form of writing, poems are a different form of writing, but these are personal poems, very poetic, but also personal. And for example, one of them is about an encounter with Pasternak, right? And you can see recreated in that is what the discussion between him and Pasternak was really like. Again, you know, capturing real occasions, real moments.
Well, one of the other things that's hanging over his work and many Yiddish poets is socio-political polemics. And I know that before the war, he, with Yung-Vilne, had some disagreements about how political poetry ought to be. And of course, some of his poetry in Israel is considered to be Zionist poetry. Do you see Sutzkever's poetry as political or not?
Well, you know, so when Sutzkever was a young man growing up in Vilna, I mean, Vilna was, according to my parents, who, my mother is born in Vilna and my father studied in Vilna, so I feel that Vilna is the only city in the world as far as my brother, my younger brother and I were concerned, and in our household, Vilna made you feel that your life was nothing. You were growing up in Montreal, you could even be growing up in New York or Paris or whatever, forget about it. If you had not lived in Vilna in the 20s, then you had not lived, and I am persuaded of that. So, and one of the things that persuades me of it is reading about Sutzkever. So when Sutzkever was about 16 years old, there was this group of poets and writers and artists called Yung-Vilne. They had already begun to publish. But you couldn't join Yung-Vilne. You had to be interviewed, right? So he was interviewed one day, and he came, and Yung-Vilne at that point was very left-wing, and it was, all the poetry was that kind of, you know, red, dead, need. It was all, you know, die Massen in die Gassen, and you know, build the barricades and so forth. Sutzkever came and he read the poems which were the embryonic form of his poem Siberia, about Kyrgyzians, about snowmen, about the sunlight in Siberia, about the gorgeousness. And his friend Shmerke Kaczerginski, whom you mentioned, said to him, and Sutzkever himself quotes this, he said, Abrasche, die Zeit ist von Stahl, nicht Kristall. This is a time of steel, not crystal. Again, you see everybody playing on words there. So it's so interesting about politics. So here he was, quite deliberately spitting or you know, defying the laws of poetry in his time in order to write poems of his own encounter with nature, of sublime aspirations, very interesting poems, but really very, very deliberately apolitical. And then come the 1930s and 1938, 39, 40. The Russians take Vilna, and for 2 years it's under Russian and then Lithuanian rule. Then the Germans come. It's very hard to avoid what you would call politics.
Right.
What would you call politics? I mean, it is impossible to differentiate. And just parenthetically, I mean, I think that your question hurts in a sense because it's very troubling. People put up, for example, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and believe it or not, the people who put up the Holocaust Museum tried to keep it apolitical. Apolitical. It's not supposed to be political. You know, in other words, that it was conceived of, I guess, as a kind of Christological thing that, this people on the cross, this people destroyed, let us go see this and we will have a redemptive experience and never want to confront evil again, you know. But it was political, right? So when he writes Nazism,
He means it politically.
Yes, I mean, you know, they knew what. So it's a complicated. It goes to your question of history, right? He was caught up by history, and the history that overwhelmed the Jews has been political.
Right. But, you know, also, these Yiddish poets, like even the ones in America, Gladstein, saw the destruction of Yiddish as part of this political movement.
Yes, that
it
is-
was destroyed too. And there are these poems that make you weep about how Yiddish has died in this catastrophe.
Well, I'm glad that you bring this up because it's very interesting that for many people who think about Yiddish, what they pick up on is the degree to which the building of the State of Israel required making Hebrew the national language. This has never happened in human history, that a high-level language is reclaimed as a vernacular. What the Jews did with Hebrew is a linguistic miracle.
Right.
No other people has ever been able to do that. Take a language that was relegated to a high function and make it into a living language. And of course they did that spontaneously, but also by saying, listen, everybody who functions has to speak Hebrew. And Yiddish was the most spoken language, so of course Yiddish was the great threat. And if you're a Yiddish poet, when we talked about, you can't change your instrument.
Right.
So for other people, for just speakers of Yiddish, it might have been painful to switch to another language, but you do it. To buy bread, you switch to another language. But if you were a poet and this is your language, it was painful. Here's the strange thing that I don't think has been said enough. The people who wrote the most fantastic poetry about Israel in its early years were the Yiddish poets, including, by maybe foremost among them, Avrom Sutzkever. He wrote about every aspect of the state of Israel. He went everywhere in the country. He went to places where you were not allowed to go because it was very dangerous, but he got taken there to the Dead Sea. He got taken to places, and he wrote about the landscape, about the animals, about the situations, about climbing the mountains, about every aspect of it. And he was not alone. So isn't this, it is really something. And he set up prizes there. And let me repeat, in addition to being this great poet whom we're discussing, the first thing he did when he came to Israel was to say, I am going to found a journal of Yiddish literature here in Tel Aviv. And he got the Histadrut, Ben-Gurion's Histadrut, Ben-Gurion, who was the great enemy of Yiddish. He got the Histadrut to fund that journal, the likes of which does not exist in the history of Yiddish literature. He kept it going until the end of his life. And all the great Yiddish writers wrote for Die Goldene Keyt, this quarterly that Sutzkever edited painstakingly. So the love of Yiddish, I mean, you put out this journal and you get all the best writers to write for your journal, right? But at the same time, of course, you know that you're living in a country where this language is not the language of the land the way it was in Vilna.
Right. Or Warsaw.
Or
Yeah.
Warsaw, no, or
Right,
Eastern
exactly.
Europe.
Yeah, I think that to me that's one of the things that's very poignant about that poetry of that period, that he is participating in this movement, he's registering it, he's telling a story, but he's also doing it in a very nuanced and sometimes in a subversive way. That the Golden Kate is a chain that is spun in Yiddish, and it's a story that's being told in Yiddish, even while it is not a story of Yiddish in a way. Yeah. So I have more things to talk about, but we
Wait,
have a lot of
this poor
questions here,
gentleman
so
has
let's
been
open it
sitting here
up.
with us
Yeah,
all- yes.
Jane will bring you a microphone.
Dr. Ruth Weiss, you were my professor at McGill over 40 years ago, and it's really great to see you again.
Thanks. Same
And
here.
I wanted to ask you about, I don't remember the whole poem, I just remember it was so powerful. There was a very powerful poem called, I don't know the name of it, that Sutzkever wrote called, "If you wish to see eternity, dim your eyes." And it goes on to talk about the walls of Jerusalem. And while I was reading it, I was practically crying, because he made the walls of Jerusalem like eternity. And since
Yes.
we've been waiting thousands of years, it's like that. I don't know if you're familiar with that poem.
Right, but yes, but at the same time, that's on the high level. But it's interesting that in the poem that I read, if you notice, wo jeder Steindl is mein Seide. So there he chooses not the wall, not the stones of the wall, of the Western Wall, but where every pebble is my grandfather. So it's just sometimes the large, as you say, and sometimes the very quotidian.
Hi. It's difficult to formulate this question, but I'm seeing a motif in two of the poems. The first one that was read, not the first one, the Norwich forest. This wasn't discussed. With Vilna in my heart, like a bullet that cannot be removed. So there it's as if he's been killed himself. He's taken a bullet, and then the bullet comes in later. But similarly, in the Shehechianu, which is so interesting, he has
After
already
my
been
Akeda.
sacrificed. And so this, I'm wondering about the level of the irony here, because in the opening line, were I not at one with you, who is that you? Is that simply other people in Israel, other Jews, or could it also be God, or is it the land? Is it ambiguous? And then I guess my real question comes with that last 11th line that you were speaking about, Professor Weiss. My longing would come on its own. What does that mean? It's as if the longing is disembodied. Is there some kind of religious sense in here, almost mysticism, that the longing is disembodied? If I were not here at all, my longing would still be here. So
Well,
could you expand on that a little bit?
I don't know. I can, as Bobby said, interpretation of poetry is, the poem is there. The interpretation is just yours or mine. But for me, I feel it very intensely, and that is that the Jews, if it were not for the Jewish longing for the land of Israel, we certainly would never have reclaimed the land of Israel. I mean, it's the most extraordinary thing. How do you keep longing for a land for 2,000? Your longing is so powerful that the longing creates the reality. And I think that what he had to do was to really personify, if you will, that longing, because that longing it's not disembodied. It's the, no, it says the yes. Yes, but you can't say the word longing without understanding that it is embodied in something. yeah, it is not, longing is a verb that has action in it. Longing is an action verb. And so that action has to be propelled by a force. And one feels the force of that longing. One knows what he was speaking about. I mean, Jews, you see it to this day. Jews, even in Jerusalem, say they long for Jerusalem rebuilt. So, you know, it's a reality in Jewish life. An organized longing, I would say. As far as the Akeda is concerned, though, it's just a footnote. You're quite right to notice it, because death is ever present, and it is his own death. Among other things, of course, he writes poems about his mother's death, in the ghetto, which he could not do anything to prevent. And their infant son was born in the ghetto and immediately put to death. So, in a sense, the Akeda can also be Avrom. His name is Avrom. He can also be the Abraham in this Akeda, as well as the one describing his almost death. You see, father and child.
A small caveat about the question that was raised before. Questioned why did he have to write in Yiddish. Actually, this was his main language, and not simple a main language, because he grew up in a town next to Vilna, Bygone, which was dominated. He attended the Shomer HaTzair. There was a resurrection of Zionist life in this town, and I have several photos from my mother at that Lake Norwich, where they really before that was created later on, this walking and Wandervogel and later on in Israel, crossing the cities. And another element, this what we're mentioning, the longing. This word Bankshaft, which is a key word in the song about Vilna, which was written in New York but by two ex-Vilnas, it really ties him very, very much deep. Once again, in no other language he could have really. He soaked Yiddish, and it was his 95% of his psychological and emotional life.
But it is interesting that he did say that, his mother spoke Hebrew to his brother. This is his mother spoke Hebrew to his brother, the brother who went to Israel in the 30s. So it was a multilingual household in some sense. But
on the same poem, I have a question about the last line of, and my longing would have, is it, in Hebrew, is the verb form translated would have come? Does Hebrew have, does Yiddish have that kind of would have come instead of would come? And then,
yes, would have come.
Okay, and is there a my longing? Is there a my? Is it restricted to his own longing, or is it more generalized in the Hebrew, in the Yiddish?
Mein Bengtschaft.
So, does that? I thought before that you implied that it was the longing of all those who did not come.
Yes.
And I wanted you to explain that. And also the translation on its own. Could you gloss that in Yiddish?
Wo ist mein Bänkschaft wollt gekommen? And only my longing would have come. But my longing would be my longing, but the longing of me who is not here. So in other words, that is...
Perhaps for a final question, unless somebody have the microphone right now. Okay, yeah.
Mein Wert ist eine Schreifahrt for the letzte Wert. But on this word that the professor now spoke of, the blois, the only, I'm looking also back to the first line. The last word in that first line, to me, evokes the word Zebanayan. When he speaks of Banayan, but I think of Banayan. Shehechianu actually refers to a reliving. In other words, it's not so much, when I say the bracha, it's not so much that we're thanking the Bar Shalom for giving us life, but for renewing our life. And I believe that's what, the way the words speak to me, and the Akutin, is that Rabbi Avrom is saying how without the land of Israel, he would be dead. He would be like Fagoyet. He would be like an empty corpse, not a Jewish living body. And the land has given him life. And without that, he would be just longing. He would be like a Luftmensch, just Luft. Bloy is the Bankchef, just some wistful, empty spirit.
Well, there's just, since you're all such wonderful readers and so attentive to the language, let me just say in the words of Uriel Weinreich why he drew attention to the rhymes. Because if you look at the rhymes, of 4 of the rhymes at any rate, the rhyming words are from the sources of Yiddish. So Chevle Leda is from the Hebrew Aramaic, Zede is from the Slavic, Veda is from the Germanic sources. So this poem plays, which is about the synthesis of coming together, also does that with the rhymes that says this. And this is really extraordinary.
One question that I thought we could discuss as a way of ending is taking up on this idea of the ancient Bankshaft and of the keyt and of these biblical imagery. How might we think of Sutzkever as a part of a larger Jewish tradition? I think it was very interesting that you said that this could be a liturgical poem, and I wonder if you could both reflect on that a bit.
Go ahead. Well, Bobby knows the late Benjamin Harshav, who taught at Yale for so many years. We taught Yiddish literature, and we teach Yiddish literature because that is our way of bringing Yiddish into the Jewish present. But it's a much larger question. I mean, you can see what the Jewish people is capable of to the degree that it was able to revive the Hebrew language when it considered it necessary. And language is not a toy. I mean, people say, why don't we do this? Well, language is not like that. Language is a need, it's a necessity. People speak it and they create it only because they have to have it. And so, the erasure of Yiddish culture and of all that was done in Yiddish is like, I've likened it very often to a lobotomy. And it's like you take out a part of the mind, because all of Jewish modernity, actually, much of it got created in the Yiddish language. All the arguments, all the propositions, everything that was tried, that failed and succeeded, all the emotions and the thoughts, all of this took place in Yiddish. We consider ourselves a cultured people, and yet you have a cultured people that has lost touch with the whole period of its modernization. That has been sort of eclipsed. And that is really huge. And I think that Sutzkever's poetry, which registers so many things, so many subtleties, and so many difficulties, right? That the loss of it is it's not so much that one is sorry for him or for Yiddish poetry and for all that is lost, as if, yes, exactly. It's the living body of a people.
Let me add to that, because the distinction between the emotional charge of Yiddish and that of Hebrew. I mean, those characters came to Palestine, turn of the 20th century, and they created what I call a pass the salt language. It's very practical. It's so, if you listen to the second Aliyah people, it's very unemotional. I mean, Yitzhak Rabin was the great exponent of that. Yiddish, on the other hand, it's warm. It's angry. It's loving. It's all of that Hebrew, in fact, doesn't have until now. I remember the first time I was in Israel and I heard somebody on a bus talking to a baby and calling them ketzle. And that took me back to my mother. Ima doesn't do it, and
Well, Imale does.
huh?
But Imale.
Imale, right? Of course.
Well, thank you both so much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you all for coming, and we hope you'll join us here for another event sometime soon. Take care.